Well, thank you all for being here, and particularly to thank Ranan deHaas, our Shaliach, who has much on his shoulders, particularly now, I think, as our official representative from Medinat Yisrael. I want to thank Mike Harris for setting up the tech setup here today. We are, looks like a dozen or so or more at home, and half dozen or so here in the synagogue. So first I want to say just a welcome to Ra'anan. And when we talked a couple of weeks ago about Ra'anan's coming and talking to us about what was going on, I think we had no idea even what a momentous week this would be. And so we're really blessed that on the heels of so much dramatic that has happened in Israel, that you're here to come and talk to us, give us your perspective, and respond to our questions. I think what Ranan will do is to talk, and at whatever time you want to stop, we'll entertain questions, which you can submit if we can have them here and figure out how to verbalize them, and/or you can put them in the chat if you're Zoom savvy in that way. I think it's really important in setting this stage to say a few things. One is the importance of Zionism to our community, and that the project of the State of Israel and of Zionism is something that we all share in. We share in it differently, whether we are Jews of America or people who are citizens of Israel, but we share it together. The project of Jewish values and principles and what it means to be exert power and agency in the world is the miracle of our time, which Israelis experience dramatically and American Jews experience in our own way as well. And talking about what has gone on with the initiatives and the protests in Israel is part of our solidarity. And so you may be here as kind of an observer wondering what's going on. You may be here as a feeling of participation. This is something that I am a part of, this story of what does Jewish and democratic mean in the modern world. Most of our great-grandparents, some of our grandparents, some of us, our very selves have lived under tyrannies, and we know what a gift it is to live in modern times. And here in this congregation, thinking about Israel and these ideas is about Zionism, and it is about Torah. And we all wish for the fulfillment of all of those things, and especially in this special year of milestone of the 75th anniversary coming up of Medinat Yisrael. So I think that's good for introduction, and I turn it over to Ranan.
Thank you, Rabbi. Do I need to speak up? Can you hear me on Zoom? Is this okay? Perfect. So yeah, that was a great introduction, and I appreciate it. So I assume at this point that you know who I am, and if you haven't been listening so far, I'm Ranan, I'm the Israeli emissary, and I'll say that this is awkward because on one hand, I want to look at the people in the room and look straight to the camera, but the screen showing you is over here, so if I glance over there, I apologize. And I want this to be a discussion. I want it to be, obviously I'll start by talking and giving a little bit of background, but feel free to bombard me with questions in the chat. And Rabbi John, if you can monitor that, if there's something that people are asking and you feel that it's relevant to what I'm talking about at that point, stop me, because I want it to be a real discussion, because I want you to leave here feeling like you understand a little bit more about what's going on in Israel. We're not going to leave here fully understanding it. It's hard to fully understand. I'm sure I don't fully understand it. People living in Israel right now don't fully understand what's going on. But I'll try to shed a little bit of light on the system in general, and specifically the past few months. As I'm sure you know, Israel has been through a whirlwind of political mayhem over the past 5 years, more or less, 4 or 5 years, leading to election cycle after election cycle after election cycle. And without going too much into the reasoning behind that, but if you have questions about that, feel free to do so, it led us to about 3 or 4 months ago when this new government was formed. This government is a very right-wing government ideology, and when we say right and left in Israel, majority of the time you're talking about security, and you're talking about I'd say the Palestinian problem, or Palestinian solution, and what's going on with there. So right wing, being very not politically correct and being very generalizing what's going on, is if you are, obviously there's extreme right and extreme left, but the moderate right want some sort of one-state solution, whether it's, and if you go extreme right, you say, well, the Arabs can leave, or worse, or can be forced to leave. And if you're moderate right, you say, well, we need to find some sort of balance. The left are saying a two-state solution. The extreme left might be saying, one state, but that's not necessarily Jewish. But it's all, when you're saying right and left in Israel, that's what you're talking about. So this government, in general, is a right-wing government when it comes to security. On some level, when it comes to economy, it's more conservative, but some aren't. And so this government, and let me take a step back. Sorry, this is awkward, so I'm trying to look at people, but I can't look at people. So this government is built out of four major parties. The first is the Likud party, head by Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi, we all know him. The second largest party is the religious Zionist party, head by Bezalel Smotrich, who is now the finance minister. Another influential person in that party is Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the national security minister, or the minister in charge of police and border patrol and everything that's a national security, so fire department, etc. The third party is Shas party, head by Aryeh Deri, who was in the news recently because his ministry position was turned down by the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court's a big topic we're going to talk about in a minute. And the fourth party, the Shas party, is a Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party, Haredi party. The religious Zionist party is a religious Zionist side, a modern Orthodox party. And the last party is the UTJ, United Toward Judaism party, which is the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi party. So we have three Orthodox parties in this coalition, very conservative. And then we have the Likud party, which is a more liberal but right-wing party. The Likud has a long history of, what their beliefs are depending on who's leading that party. In the past 20 years or so, it's been under Netanyahu, who's also been prime minister for most of those years. So, 5 months ago, this government is formed, and now they have to govern. And one of the first things that this new government puts themselves to do as a major agenda is a judicial reform. Now, it sounds like a big word. And let me take you a little bit back to how the political system in Israel works, how the government works. So, like most democracies, we have three different branches of government. We have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. The legislative is the Knesset, 120 members representing the people, each party getting the amount of seats depending on the percentage of the votes they get, anywhere from 4, which is the minimum amount of seats you can get, to the Likud right now that has 32 seats, which is the biggest party. These 120 members write the laws, vote on the laws, and are able to, basically do what the people do the people's wants and needs. The second branch of government is the executive branch. It is the coalition, or the ministers, and it's the equivalent to the cabinet in the U.S. and all the secretaries that basically enforce and go and I don't need to explain basic civics, but basically act upon the laws that were given by the legislative. And the third branch is judicial, which is represented by the Supreme Court. Same like in the U.S., Supreme Court oversees everything that the government does and makes sure, and that's where we're going to get into controversy, but make sure that everything the government does is legal and, not to use a loaded word, but kosher. So that's the general how it works. The problem in Israel is that a large part, or the majority, of the legislative is also the executive. In a parliament system that has only one chamber, unlike the UK that has two chambers in the parliament system, or even the US that has two chambers in the legislative, once the majority, the coalition, which by definition they have over 60 seats in the legislative, and they're the ones that are putting together the executive, you get to a point where there is no separation of power between the two. Because anything that the executive wants to happen, they have that majority in the legislative. I hope that makes sense. And if it doesn't, let me know. So we get to the point that the only oversight over the Knesset, these 120 members that passed laws, is the judicial branch. Now, the judicial doesn't have infinite power, and it shouldn't. The same way you don't want the Knesset to be able to do whatever they want, or the government to do, you also don't want the judicial system to be able to do whatever they want. And when we're talking about what's going on now in Israel, it's trying to find that balance between who has more power, who has more say. And I'll pause for a second if there were any questions or if anyone has any comments just about that. We're good, okay. So, 4 months ago, this government was founded. Yariv Levin, who is the new appointed justice minister, he is number 2 in the list of the Likud, so he is not he is someone with a voice that needs to be heard. He is a high-ranked minister in this new government, and he lays out his plan to change the judicial system. Some would call it a change, some would call it an overhaul, a revolt, and everything in this, all the adjectives you can use, but basically it's to change the way it is because, according to what he says, and this government is saying, the judicial, in the balance between judicial and executive, the judicial has way too much power, so what he's trying to do is balance it out. The protest that you've been hearing about in Israel, and the outrage that came after that, because if he says he's trying to do this, the hundreds of thousands are protesting is thinking he's doing the opposite. He is taking too much power from the judicial system and putting it into the hands or the pockets of the politicians. And that's, the base of what's going on now in Israel. How do we balance these two branches of governments, keeping in mind Israel basically just has the two. Not one should have infinite power over the other, and finding that balance is where everything now is boiling up. This is what we're trying to figure out in Israel. So what are these changes that he wanted to do in the judicial system? They could be broken down into 3 major legislations that he was trying to pass, or he is trying to pass. And when I say is, let's put an asterisk about the past 3 days in Israel, and talk about everything we're going to talk about now is until the last 3 days in Israel. So they were trying to pass 3 major legislations. The first is trying to change the committee that appoints Supreme Court justices. The Israeli Supreme Court has 15 justices. It is not a lifetime appointment. I think they're there till either the age of 60 or 65, and there's also a term limit. And every few years, you need to appoint new members to that committee. What the committee right now is built out of 3 different groups. The first group is politicians from the coalition, so these are people from the government. The second group is representatives from the judicial system, so this is Supreme Court justices, either current or former justices are on this committee. And the third, which to this day I don't understand why, and that's something we can disagree on, is lawyers and people from and representatives from of lawyers that are there to also, I say, balance the power between the two. And you have to have consensus to appoint anyone to the Supreme Court right now, because both sides, both the politicians and the judges, have a veto power. So in order to bring anyone up to the Supreme Court, you have to have consensus. I will put a pin in that, saying, in general, especially in Israel, with the way that politics work, but the veto power for the judges is more powerful than the politicians, because the judges can wait it out. If the judges decide they don't want this candidate, they can say, we'll wait a few months, we'll have a new justice minister, because politics in Israel are fickle, and if someone will change, and we'll get someone else who will vote, who will agree for our candidate, or will take away the candidate the politicians want until they compromise something we agree on. So I get that. I get that, and that's something that they're claiming is a big issue, which you can understand, because judges are there. It's hard to remove them. They're going to do it for a while. If they keep on vetoing anything the government wants, eventually the government will change. So they want to change that committee. Now, there are two different offers on the table, or now there are actually three different offers on the table. But in general, to really generalize what's going on, they want that the politicians of the coalition will have a majority in the committee. Some being ministers, some being a specific appointed people, being members of Knesset who aren't ministers, but basically giving the politicians a 6-5 majority, or if there's 9, so a 5-4 majority over this committee, and taking away that veto power that we talked about for both sides. Basically saying politicians are going to be the ones nominating the judges directly. Now, you could say, but that's what's going on in the U.S. The president, the executive branch, nominates a Supreme Court justice. In the U.S., though, and in many other countries, many different systems, it still has to go through the Senate, the legislative. Israel doesn't have that system. So if you're giving the coalition, the government, the ability to basically nominate whoever they want to be a Supreme Court justice without any oversight, without any committee or separate committee going through this, making sure, vetting them, making sure they have the ability to be there, and the values and what we want as a Supreme Court justice, that's giving them too much power. And that's by the way, the legislation that went the furthest in the legislative process, and which erupted all these protests. And that's one of the things that they want to change. And you can say, well, you're still giving the Supreme Court enough power, because even if the coalition, the government, nominates these people, they're not going to nominate Joe Schmo from the street. They're going to nominate someone who's been in the courts for a while, who is able to look at things and understand and decide if they are legal or not. They're not going to, nominate. It's going to be hard for them to just nominate their second cousin to be a Supreme Court justice. The second legislation, the second thing that this government tried to do is something called the judicial oversight, to change the ability of the Supreme Court to have judicial oversight over the government. So right now, any law that passes in Israel, the Supreme Court is able to look at it and say, this is unconstitutional. Now, Israel doesn't have a constitution. But in 1995, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court looked at Israel's laws and said there are some laws that the government itself decided are basic laws. Basic laws are how Israel is supposed to run. It talks about, how many members of Knesset are there? There are elections every 4 years. What's the role of the president as opposed to the prime minister, and what's the role, and what are the basic rights that individuals have in Israel? The freedom to and from religion, the freedom of press and freedom of speech, and all these things are under what are called basic laws. So the Supreme Court back then in the 90s said, this is how we are going to pass judgment. Everything that the government tries to do, we're going to look and compare it to these basic laws. If there's no contradiction, okay, this is fine. If there's a contradiction, we give ourselves, and so that's what I'm saying, they give themselves the power to overrule a law that the Knesset passes, that the legislative pass, because it contradicts with a basic law. Now, till today, the government has passed a bunch of basic laws, and those, even though some of them have had scrutiny and criticism from the Supreme Court, they have never overruled one, a basic law. So, what this government is trying to do is to say, as the Supreme Court, one, we're going to make it harder to overrule the law. So we're going to have to, instead of having a panel of 9 judges or 10 judges, all 15 have to rule with an 80% approval to overrule a law. And you're like, okay, that makes sense, because you want it to be a consensus that this law is unconstitutional. The second thing they're doing is they're saying, and you can't overrule any basic law. A basic law is how Israel is run. It's up to the executive or to the legislative to decide how the country is run, not the judicial. The judicial shouldn't tell me how my country should run. I should tell it how I'm running it, and then I'll pass laws, and if I contradict myself, let me know. That can make sense. The root of the problem is, in order to pass a basic law in Israel, the only thing you need to do is to write in the title of the law, basic law, comma, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There is no difference in passing a basic law and a regular law in Israel when it comes to the process you need to go through. So it could be basic law, and some of these examples are going to be extreme and not realistic, but just to show you the ability that it would give them. Basic law, women can't vote. Well, that's against our Constitution, but it's a basic law. It goes through the same easy process of 3 rounds of voting in the Knesset, and it won't have any oversight. Basic law, no more Pride Parade in Tel Aviv. Basic law, everything must be closed on Shabbat, no exceptions. Taking away this balance of our freedoms and the rights that are also in this basic law, in another basic law. So once they're giving themselves the ability to pass a basic law without judicial oversight, that is another thing that took people to the street, saying, wait a minute, in that balance of the powers, that is giving the executive or the legislative way too much. It's not balancing it, it's tipping the scale the other way. The third thing, major thing that they were trying to do, or they are trying to do, is something called an override clause. So if we go through this process of the Knesset passing a law, a regular, not on a basic one, because the basic ones can't be overruled, but they go through the process of passing a basic law, and that basic law, the judges, all 15 of them, 80% of them agree that it's unconstitutional. And they say, wait a minute, this is, we can't agree to this, we are overruling this, it is shut down. It goes back to the Knesset. Now the Knesset could decide to change the law or try to pass it again with a different wording, and that's okay. That's what politicians do. They try to find, a way to work the system. But what this government is trying to do is trying to pass an override clause, which gives the government the ability to overrule what the Supreme Court's ruling is. And that's not something they made up. That's something that a lot of countries that have this kind of system have, because again, you don't want infinite power with the Supreme Court. You can't have a rogue court turning down every law that comes. But then the question comes, in order to overrule the Supreme Court, what kind of majority do you need? Some would say, for example, if there's a constitutional convention in the US, you need a supermajority, Everyone has to agree. It has to be consensus. It's something that the people want, with the politicians representing them being able to come together, both sides of the aisle, to do this. This government wants a simple majority to be able to do this. So a 61 vote. Basically saying those same 61 that voted to pass this law originally got turned down, and now they're saying, well, with those same 61, we will overrule what the Supreme Court said. So all three of these things together, when people looked at that, they were saying something's fishy. This is not, each one of these individually, you could say, okay, there might be a reasoning behind it. It may balances, I don't agree with it, or this might be very extreme. But the joint of these three, in addition to many other smaller legislations that went through, became, or not necessarily came through, or trying to come through, basically brought protesters to the streets. And from week one, about 3 months ago, when Yariv Levin, the justice minister, laid out his plan, there have been protests in the streets, starting with a couple of thousand, the weekend later, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, 100,000. Every week it grew and grew, because while these protests were going on, they were, continued with the legislation. And at no point, and this is something the government right now admits that they were at fault, no one from the government stood up and said, this is why we're doing it. This is the logic behind it. The only thing they would say is, you are anarchists in the streets that are trying to stop a democratically elected government from doing what the people want, and we are going to make Israel more democratic. Now, they might believe that, and that's okay, but the logic was not conveyed to the people. And from week to week, more and more protesters were out in the streets until, I think one of the biggest ones, again, until the past 3-4 days that we're talking about, were over 250,000 people on the street on one weekend, all the way from Metula up north on the Lebanese border to Eilat, spanning people on the right and on the left. This is not a left-wing protest. This was a protest for and against this reform. There were people in settlements in the West Bank that are very right-wing conservative people, but understood or felt that if this goes through, this is going to be a problem for Israel's ability to be a democracy. Potentially. We're not saying that this government will go through with all these things that then take away the right to vote from Arabs or women or gay rights or anything like that. They're not saying that they're going to do that. But just the ability of any government. Next week, this government falls apart, a new government comes up, and they have the ability to do whatever they want. And having that ability is what scared people to the streets. I want to make sure I didn't forget anything leading up to the past few days. Any questions in the chat or from the room?
You don't have to answer it now, but a few days ago, maybe a week or two ago, Herzog presented a plan.
Right. Oh, that's a good. Yeah.
I don't know what that was exactly.
That's a good comment. Did they hear? Were they able to hear?
Yeah, why don't you repeat that?
So the question was, about a week or 2 weeks ago, I think at this point, President Herzog, who is the Israeli...
You want to say with the president?
Right, I was going to say, the Israeli president, I want a little more than, but basically a figurehead. He has no power, executive power or legislative power. He's a voice that people listen to. He gets voted in by the Knesset, and usually there's a consensus around the person that gets appointed. Specifically, Herzog used to be a politician and a minister, and by the way, his father used to be the president. And his job in general is to be, the Israeli representative abroad if he goes for I'd say he's more like, not to compare, but he's more like the king or queen than a politician. But he and others over these past 3 months have tried to bring people to the table, has tried to create a setting of compromise. After trying for weeks and weeks to call people to the table, he took action. He came out with a plan saying, I heard this side, I heard that side. This is my judicial reform plan, which is unheard of, that the president would come with basically a bill to try to pass. But he says, this is something I think we can agree on as people, the people of Israel, not a party. It was turned down by the people in the coalition trying to, because they said, like, first of all, to be very honest, the plan that he laid out was very far from the plan that they wanted to pass. And they said to him, sorry, we have a majority. We have 64 seats out of these 120. We can pass this without compromise. They're not wrong. They could. And others have tried to come to the table. And another thing to remember, to listen to, is the opposition, which the opposition is whoever isn't in the government. They don't necessarily represent the people on the street. These protests were grassroots protests coming from individuals, coming from organizations that aren't represented by politicians. Obviously, I'd say the majority of these people in the streets have voted to one of these politicians, but they could have also voted to one of these politicians that are in the coalition right now. And this judicial reform or judicial change that they were trying to do has a huge impact on Israel beyond just the judicial system. Economists were coming out and saying this will tank Israel's credit and the ability of investors to invest in high tech. The high tech workers were coming out and saying we reject this. The business owners, and basically every sort of group, association, union came out and said, a reform could be needed, we can agree on that, but it has to be a reform formed by compromise. And that's what everyone was saying. Look, there's some people who say, no reform is needed at all, but those are the fringes, those are few. The majority of Israelis agree some sort of reform or change needs to happen, and that same majority says, but we need to compromise on it. We can't go all the way this way, and we can't go all the way that way. Everyone agrees, or the majority, I said, agrees that there is an imbalance right now. And maybe we're not going to get it to here, but from here to get it to here, that's a huge step forward. Maybe even getting it to here, maybe even flipping that balance, tipping it the other way a bit, but not like this. And that's where we are, or we were 3 or 4 days ago. Sarita. Well, so that's why we're not at 3 or 4 days ago yet. That's exactly why I wanted to. Oh, I don't. Sorry. Rabbi John?
In the question was asked, which was, isn't part of, don't some of the reaction to this have to do with proposals that would make it harder for the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is in a criminal, or whatever, he's in court, being prosecuted, would this affect that? And how much is that factor tied up with the other structural things that you're talking about?
Were they able to hear you? Or? Okay. So first of all, Sarit asked a question that about the past few days, and I said I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Rabbi John asked about, or someone from the chat through Rabbi John was asking about how Netanyahu's own investigation or trial for corruption, embezzlement, how is that being affected by these judicial changes? And first of all, it's putting a dark cloud over it, because it doesn't seem in good faith. Because once And he's not the only one. There are others in this government that have legal battles that they're fighting. And once they are the ones spearheading this change, you have to take a step back and think, well, maybe their incentive isn't just change, maybe it's to change. For example, Netanyahu, if if he's found guilty, his appeal will go to the Supreme Court. But wait a minute, if he's the one appointing these judges, suddenly that's not kosher. Aryeh Deri, who is the head of the Shas party, we talked about his nomination to be a minister was turned down by the Supreme Court. So if they appoint the new Supreme Court justices, and he's appointed a minister again in a year or 2 or 5, suddenly maybe that decision will be overturned. So there's no direct line going between a legislation to an exemption from trial. But if you connect the dots, it's not a hard, connect dots.
Things I was showing you before, there is a law being proposed to exempt the Prime Minister from being prosecuted. There's a law being proposed to disallow recordings, which is part of the evidence against him, without consent.
So,
There's a law being proposed to get Aryeh Deri back in the government.
no, you're right. So the question was about other legislation that maybe is an easier connect the dot. But yes, so I was laying out like the 3 major things that are going on right now.
We're talking about the judicial reform.
Right, but so all of this has, at some level, all the legislation, or most of the legislation they're trying to pull through the past 4 months, has at some level to change the system. The ability to get gifts and donations to legal battles of politicians, something that's illegal right now in Israel, but something they want to change that. Nothing to do with the legal battle that some individual is fighting in the Knesset right now. So they're saying, like, it's not, there are about 100 plus proposals of legislation that have 100% to do with this reform that they're talking about. Over 100 different laws, some bigger, some smaller. These are the major ones. Each one of these major ones has, smaller ones that lead up to it. But if I don't know them all, and if we had to go through them all, we would have to leave here after Passover. So, going back to a few days ago, an anecdote, or it's not an anecdote, but something that I'm sure you've heard in the news, is Israel over the past few months, in addition to the protest and the reform, has been going through security issues. There have been a bunch of terror attacks within Israel. There was one in downtown Tel Aviv a few months ago with 2 injured, or actually 1 died from his injuries. And there have been terror attacks in a Palestinian village called Hawara. There have been retaliation attacks by settlers against people in Hawara. It's been a mess, to say lightly. In addition to Iran being closer and closer to a nuclear weapon, in addition to a terrorist that infiltrated from Lebanon to inside Israel, to 2 hours away from the Lebanese border, and put a bomb on the street that I'm not sure if he killed or hurt an Israeli citizen. All that together brought a new character into this mess, because until a few days ago, there was basically this coalition, the 64 members were all they were whipped, to use the American term, into voting the way the government said. This is our agenda. No one was looking left or right. No one was crossing the aisle and trying to compromise. If the coalition, the government says vote, that's what you do. And a few days ago, the defense minister, who oversees all these attacks and all the IDF and the Shin Bet, the Shabak and the Mossad, and he sees all these threats. He's hearing what's going on. He's hearing from commanders and he's hearing from intelligence officers that threats are rising. People, our enemies, Israel's enemies, are seeing that we are slowly being torn from the inside, and they're waiting for that they might attack. So when he comes out and says, and maybe he did it without, say, with bad class, because he did it when Netanyahu was in UK on an official business, an official prime ministerial delegation. So that's when he stood in front of the cameras, and he has the right to do so, and he said, not that he disagrees with the reform, but he basically says, I am calling from here to Netanyahu and everyone else, let's pause this reform. We need to summon the cabinet, the security cabinet, and deal with the immediate threats for Israel, and not with the changes right now. He didn't say he's going to vote against it when it comes to the vote. He didn't say that he opposes. He said, I am very much for this reform, but we need to put it on hold because there are threats to this country. And less than 24 hours later, he was fired from his ministry position. Now, if there's one thing close and dear to almost all Israelis, is the military, is security. So we all have lived through wars, intifadas, wars outside of our country with terrorist groups or with countries. Almost everyone goes to the army. Everyone knows someone in the army, knows someone who might have gotten hurt or died in the army. And once a top tier military or defense minister who used to be a general in the military, he was a candidate to be the chief of staff of the military. Once he comes in front of the nation and says, I'm raising a red flag of security, and the response is, you're fired, people started saying, this is too much to stomach. And on this Sunday night, the announcement of him being fired was about at 8 o'clock p.m. Israel time, 8 p.m. Israel time, spontaneously, because there was no protest planned for that day. Most of these protests had been planned with brochures and called for specific locations. Spontaneously, about 500,000 people went to the streets to protest in one of the biggest protests in Israel's history. And because this wasn't planned, police were caught by surprise, because these protests were usually, limited at some level to where they can be. They were blocking roads. They were disturbing the peace. But they had their limits. But suddenly, no one was prepared for this. And in Tel Aviv, these protesters were able to block, if you've ever been to Israel, the highway going straight through Tel Aviv, one of Israel's main arteries of transportation, the Ayalon, was blocked for over 5 hours into the night. And when they left in the early morning, they left barricades that had to be cleared until about 8 o'clock in the morning, well through the rush hour. In Jerusalem, these protesters were able to go through a level of security that they've never gone through before, coming close to Netanyahu's residence. We were very far away from, going into him and waking him up in his bed. Not that he was there. There were still many more layers of security, but they got to where they weren't before because there was no one there to stop them, because no one expected these protests. And this is, just two examples of places, but there was Haifa and Beersheba, and tens and hundreds of thousands in each location that just felt that it was a gut punch firing the defense minister, and he became a figurehead. He is someone that all these protesters, or the majority of them, were against 24 hours earlier, because he is still for this reform. He is still going to vote for it. But then once that happened, it felt that they felt that Netanyahu lost control, because Netanyahu, one of his taglines is Mr. Security. And once they felt he is putting security second to this judicial reform, which might be important, but it's not critical the way our security is, that was one step too far for them. 24 hours after that, we're talking about, this was Sunday night. Sunday, all through the night, there was protests till the morning. In the early afternoon, hundreds of thousands flocked to Jerusalem, where this legislation was going to, the first part of this reform was supposed to be voted on, which is the change of the committee to appoint the Supreme Court judge. It was supposed to be the final vote. Hundreds of thousands were there outside of the Knesset protesting, and in addition to them, this now became a bigger, widespread protest because Israel's major or biggest workforce union, the Histadrut, joined in on the strike, which put another hundreds of thousands on strike that day. It shut down Israel. The airport was shut down. Ports were shut down. Any museum and stuff like that. Everyone, private businesses joined this strike. You saw McDonald's closed that day in Israel. McDonald's Israel was shut for that day in protest. So it became such a big thing that at this point, Netanyahu couldn't ignore it, or this coalition couldn't ignore it the way they did up to that day, saying, we have the majority, we are 64 votes out of the 120, we are going through. Suddenly, these hundreds and hundreds of thousands, that's basically, shut Israel down. And they said, we're shutting it down with no time limit. Schools were closed, university was closed, and they were willing to keep on keeping it closed until he stops this legislation. So, on that evening, and I say, before that evening, while all this was happening for the people against the reform, there was an awakening in the group, because there is a group in Israel that are for this reform. Everyone has the right for their opinion. So a counter-protest of, depending on who you ask, some say 500,000 on the other side, which by most people are saying tens of thousands, maybe 100, 150,000 were in this counter-protest that was for this reform. And for the first time, since I remember, you see people, ministers in the government that are protesting against their own government. You saw Smotrich, the finance minister, Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, Yariv Levin, that we talked about, the justice minister, thank you. The justice minister protesting in an official protest against the government, because the government, Netanyahu, the prime minister, decided to halt the reform. And I say, or pause it. They paused it for about a month, saying we will take this month and we will, each part of the Knesset, each party or each is able to send a delegation to the president's residence, the president's office, and try and come to a consensus. So the coalition sent its people, the opposition, a few parties sent their people, trying to come to some sort of consensus. Some are saying that this is Netanyahu buying himself some time for a month and then he's just going to keep on going. Some are hoping that they'll find some sort of compromise and balancing that the legislative and the judicial. I will know in a month. At this point, I'm not getting. There's no guessing on this side because they could easily go back and spearhead this legislation through exactly how they want it, but just as easily this government could fall apart next week because something happens. So both sides are just as plausible at this point. But that's where we are right now.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
The proposals were no secret while the election campaign was going on. And, this is the majority that was elected to the Knesset. And so is it surprising that a reaction of this, magnitude happened? Are these different people than people who vote, or the same people as who voted just for the minority part?
So I'll repeat the question. The question was, if these changes or these legislations, this reform was part of their political campaign before the elections, how come there's such big outrage now that that's spanning left and right and people on both sides of the? That's the question, the gist of it. The truth is, this legislation was not part of their campaign. They campaigned on making a change to the judicial system. That was not a secret, but they never said how. And the assumption was, by everyone, is they'll make a change, maybe one of these laws, maybe two, maybe a balance of them, maybe try to tip the scale the other way, but no one expected it to be this extreme, this extreme, this fast. A constitutional change, a change in the system, in how Israel is run, can't happen in 3 months. Their original plan was to pass all these laws before Passover. That's what that's what he laid out. So no one expected this, and this wasn't what they campaigned on. Yeah, because it's not about left or right. It's deeper than that. These protests are not for or against Bibi or trying to topple this legitimately voted in government. It's saying that this government is taking the mandate they got from the people to govern and taking advantage of it, making it taking that mandate they got and trying to change the system to their benefit.
Is there a possibility that 4 of the members of Likud will vote and not support it?
Maybe. There's a lot of the protests. The question was if there's a possibility that 4 of these members of the 64, if 4 decide not to vote or to oppose this legislation, that will stop it. Well, it's a possibility.
Do you hear anything like that?
So that's to really talk about, I think that's one of the reasons these protests, of the day of the cancellation or the pause, I think and by the way, the firing of the defense minister woke a lot of the Likud members as well. People in that party were saying, wait a minute, I can't even voice my concerns and I'll get fired right away. So what there are, quotes and recordings and, texts coming out from within the Likud where Yariv Levin, keep on forgetting his title, the justice minister, said, we don't have 61 votes now, we have to stop it. So maybe there were a few members of Likud or any of the other 3 parties saying, sorry, we need to I'm for this reform, but we have to pause it right now. We have to come for a compromise. I assume that's part of it. Do I think that, if a compromise is made and maybe will they vote against it? No. Eventually, these are politicians that really care for the seat that they're on. I think unless we're talking about an extreme form of legislation, which might have a bigger protest and then have a lot of pressure on these politicians to vote against, if there's some sort of compromise, even if the protesters disagree with, they will get the votes in.
I want to ask one question to you from the chat and then a personal-ish question which you could answer or not. So one question is just in terms of keeping ourselves informed, what are sources and probably English language sources that you think we should be constantly reading to keep up?
I'll say I'm not sure about English sources because I take a lot of my news in Israel in Hebrew, but what I will say is don't limit yourself to one source of information. That's also even in Hebrew. Try finding 2 or 3 newspapers or websites or channels that will give different perspectives of what's going on, and then build your own perspective and opinion with a mesh of that. That's what I do also in Hebrew. I will recommend a podcast that I love. It's in English. It's called Unholy. It's by an Israeli news anchor and a British news anchor, and it's basically, they call it Unholy Jews on the News, and they talk, especially in the recent months, they've been talking about what's going on inside Israel, judicial reform, look back on their episodes. It's highly recommended because they give a layout of what's going on in Israel, And then in general, where they talk about is Israel and Jewish diaspora. They usually have talked about both, but in the past few months, it's been focused mainly on Israel because that's been big in the news. So that's recommended Israel. It's a once a week, 40, 50-minute podcast.
In terms of, not behind a paywall is the Times of Israel, the Jerusalem Post. Do you like them? Do you like any other sources we might subscribe to?
Jerusalem Post is great. They also have, by the way, a weekly podcast that I used to listen to, but found Unholy, which was more interesting to me. But they also have a podcast that's interesting. They also have a newspaper that's considered balanced. Obviously, every newspaper you read has some sort of agenda. Every news outlet. So make sure you know what their agenda is, what their general directive is, whether they're more conservative or liberal, but also make sure to read the opposite opinion, like talking about that same thing. And that's the only thing I can recommend without knowing specific ones. But yeah, Jerusalem Post and the Times of Israel and all of these are recommended.
Let me ask you just sort of a personal issue, which again you could answer or not in the way. First of all, I think I want to acknowledge that, so you carry a lot of burden as being the official, you have to talk for Israel here in New Hampshire. We don't have a consulate in the state, and we appreciate that, and we also appreciate that you're far from home at a time when important things are happening, and I'm sure that's got to be a challenge. I wonder if there's anything just that you've particularly seen or heard that makes you personally either proud, either because of someone we don't hear about in the news, or some dimension of this that kindles your hope and might kindle our hope through you for what's coming. Yeah.
I'll start by saying I'm not the official voice of Israel. No, standing here or anywhere I stand, obviously I represent the people of Israel, but I mostly represent myself. I don't have talking points from the government or anything like that because I don't. As an emissary, I'm not an Israeli representative. I'm a Jewish agency representative. The Jewish agency is here to represent the world Jewry, and that's an important thing because I can stand here. If I was a politician, I could not give this talk because it was filled with opinion, obviously, and I hope you understand that. There's a lot of I try to lay out facts, but I think if you can read between these very, very big lines of my opinion on this, and that's not a secret. I just wanted to make that clear. So don't feel that, I heard from Israel that. No, you heard from Ra'anan, the Israeli emissary. Individual stories, like first of all, being here so far away, I have what's called FOMO, fear of missing out of I think every single one of my friends has been to one or more than one of these protests. My brother, and I'll say this, who didn't vote in the last election, we had a huge fight over this because he was too lazy to go vote because I don't care, is out on the streets. My sister, my mom, who does nothing, everyone that in my circle is out there voicing their opinion, and I think that's very important. And I'm sure if any of you have family or friends in Israel, you can relate to that. Whether, by the way, I'd say even if you agree with this reform, chances are you're out there voicing your opinion. I think that's great because it shows Israel's strength as a democracy. We are able to protest, hundreds of thousands of people are able to protest their government. It's not the case in a lot of countries around the world. And I think I saw something pop up in the chat. I don't know.
Let's see. Thank you was what popped up in the chat.
Thank you to whoever thanked me.
Thank you, Ranan, and of course, you summed it up great, so I won't even add to that. And
thank you.
Chag Sameach.
And a Chag Sameach to all of you. Yeah.